I want to thank you for inviting me to be here with you today on this wonderful topic of faith in action and how we, in our vocations as educators, in our work in universities and high schools and educational settings, can put our faith into action and can help our students bridge the concepts and the content that we hope to be imparting with them with the more lived faith experience of putting that into practice and the ways in which that can be a wonderful opportunity for faith formation going forward. Matthew has told you a little bit about some of the things I've been involved in. So my comments and reflections with you here today will be as an academic here in Washington, D.C., but also from the work and practice that I've done with the Catholic Peace Building Network, with Jesuit Refugee Services, with the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference. So kind of this intersection of religion and politics and practice from peace builders at the front lines around the world. I've been very blessed in my life to be able to walk the road a bit with some heroic people who are working at the front lines of peace and justice, of the hot wars around the world. And so I'd like to tell you some of those stories to hope that it gives you some ideas of how you can integrate faith in action and integrate some of these stories into the work you do in your own classrooms to animate that, to inspire you as their stories inspire me. Let me find the clicker. Am I doing the wrong? There we go. My talk is entitled Resurrection Politics. And I'm very aware that this is kind of like the old Sesame Street song, one of these things is not like the other, one of these things doesn't belong. So I know that those two words may not seem to be natural partners in a sentence together, particularly after the very polarized election season we've just gone through with our own political system. The idea we think of with politics is great polarization and shouting and really great conflict. And that's not a word that we would associate with resurrection. But what I am challenging you to consider is a very, very different kind of politics. A politics of life, of hope, of connection, made possible by sharing in the creative power of God. And the God that I am referring to in this is our belief in the God of miracles, a God of endless generosity, a God of second chances, of life-giving opportunities. That kind of our beliefs in that kind of God is not just something we pray to on Sunday in Mass, but something that can be a very tremendous and transformative idea when you bring that to the political sphere, to the public square. So how can we bring our faith into action in the public square in new and creative ways? Now, as I said, my remarks to you today are not only from my experiences working at this intersection of religion and politics, but I'll also be drawing on the very deep and well-known, well-respected theological voices of my children. And, we may think that we do religious education and faith formation for our children, but all of us as educators know we learn more from our students, from our children, in understanding our own faith. And in trying to communicate and discuss faith ideas with my family, with my children, my middle child, my son, is always the one to give really the tough questions. And we were at Mass one day in a beautiful old church in Old St. Mary's in Annapolis, a historic church. He was looking at the beautiful religious artwork all around on the walls, and he said, Mommy, God is here. God is here. I said, yes, honey. Shh, shh, yes, honey. God is here in this church. Then he looked puzzled. He said, but Mommy, God is with us at home. God is with us at home. I said, yes, honey. God is with us in our family. God is with us in our home. So then he starts craning his head around, standing on the pew to try to look out the window. He said, Mom, where's God's car? So You know, it's the usual preoccupation of a young boy in all things that go, in vehicles and transportation. And this was a recurring theme. You know, we live on the Chesapeake Bay, so it wasn't long before his questions turned to, where is God's boat? You know, how does God get around? What does God use to move in heaven? You know, so all of these questions. And, you know, I was laughing at him and laughing at my attempts to try to explain the divine to him, when I realized, it hit me like a ton of bricks, I am struggling with the same question as my son. Where is God? Because it's easy to believe in God on a sunny day at the Chesapeake Bay when all is right in the world. It's much more challenging to hold on to our faith when we are confronting some of the worst conflicts, some of the most enduring human suffering. But it's what we talk about in political science as the new kind of war. It's a war not over ideology, over who gets government. It's really a war fueled by greed, fueled by money. So in the Congo today, these armed groups are combating over control of the very rich resources that exist in this country. So rather than the rich mineral resources, the rich gold and tin and tungsten and coltan, which is used in our electronics devices, it's used in our cell phones and our laptops, in the computer circuitry keyboards, rather than those minerals being a source of great prosperity and wealth, development for the people of the Congo, those have become a resource curse. Those minerals have brought in the armed combatants and been a source of enduring conflict, enduring war in the Congo. By some estimates, 6 million people have died in these ongoing conflicts in the Congo. That's as many Jews as died in the Holocaust in World War II. Yet we don't have the public perception about it, the public awareness. It's not in our headlines. And often these people in the Congo facing this conflict feel isolated and alone in their suffering. The women up on the upper right-hand portion of this slide are the women from Catholic Relief Services, Olin and Batinga, who are working in the Congo. One of the aspects, the particularly atrocious aspects of the war in the Congo, has been the use of rape as a tool of the war. Rape has been used in other conflicts around the world, in the wars of the former Yugoslavia, even in the Second World War. But rape is being used in a very horrific way in this conflict in the Congo. It has earned the Congo the dubious distinction of the United Nations calling it the rape capital of the world, where girls as young as 5, grandmothers as old as 80 are being violated. And if you can imagine, the term rape is actually too euphemistic a word to use to describe the violence, where these girls and women are being violated by tree branches, by machetes, by guns, in a deliberate attack on the human person and on the foundation of the family in the Congo. So it's taking that war from the country to the bodies of women in a way to try to cut apart, to split apart community at its most basic level, at the level of the family, to preclude these girls and women from ever being able to bear children in the future, so a form of ethnic cleansing, of cleansing of that group, but in a very deliberate attempt to destroy the social network. Now, in a terrible twist, the girls and women who are victims of this violence find themselves doubly violated. They're first violated by being victims of rape, but then they are often shunned by their families and communities because they are seen as being either contagious, that they are carrying diseases that they were inflicted upon them by the rapists, so they may be carrying HIV/AIDS or other diseases, so they may be shunned for that purpose. They may also be shunned because they may be carrying the children of the enemy, because these rapes result in pregnancy in some cases, and so they may be carrying the children of the enemy. They're also sometimes shunned and cut off from the family and their communities because of the trauma that the whole family and the community experienced around those acts of violence. So seeing those people, seeing their faces, re-traumatizes the family, re-traumatizes the community, and they just don't want to look at it. They don't want to see it. They don't want to be reminded of it. They want to move forward. So often these women and girls are shunned from their community and find themselves outside of their families, outside of their communities, at precisely the time when they need those social bonds and those supports the most. So who is stepping up for these victims of violence? Who is entering into the breach when the government of Congo is weak? They are not able to protect their own citizens from these armed groups coming in across the borders. And when these armed groups are fighting over these conflict minerals. The Catholic Church in the Congo is doing heroic work, is doing the Lord's work in conditions of great conflict, of great violence, and at great personal risk. So I mentioned Archbishop Maroy, who's on the left-hand side of the slide. He is the bishop in the area where the conflict is most severe. Huge problems of refugee flows, internally displaced persons as people flee, various episodes of violence. He got his job because his three predecessors in the position were murdered. That's what created the job opening. And so into that breach, he stepped very courageously to be a voice standing out and speaking out against the violence, speaking out to try to bring peace to that war-torn area of the world, and to try to stand for and with the victims of that conflict. The women in Catholic Relief Services doing tremendous work in programs to not only deal with psychosocial trauma counseling for these victims of rape, medical services for these victims of rape, but also to try to bring them to reintegrate in community, to restore them fully, to restore their sense of agency after they've been so beaten down and a victim of such horrendous violence. Some of the stories that Sister Marie Bernard Alima, who's the head of the Social Peace and Justice for the Congolese Bishops' Conference, they do some tremendous programs in education and training with rape victims, with victims of conflict in this area, where they are looking to restore not only their bodies and their torn psyches, but to restore their spirits and their senses of hope for the future, that they can be contributing members of society, that they are more than the wounds that they have suffered. And Sister Marie talks about women that she's worked with. They do educational and training programs. They also do political leadership training. So taking these victims of violence and training them to become the next leaders of their country, leaders of their community, saying, you understand this war better than anyone. You understand the consequences of this conflict. No one is better poised than you to try to solve this conflict, to turn that violation into a launching pad for what are you going to do now with the agency and the sacred dignity that you have. So she talks about the women that she's worked with in these education, training, and reintegration programs going on to be elected as community leaders in their villages and elected by the very men who raped them. Talk about resurrection politics. Talk about bringing life and hope and a new opportunity and reconciliation in community into a new focus. That is very courageous and creative work. And that is the work that the church around the world is doing to bring resurrection politics to bear. In the lower right-hand side of the slide is Father Ferdinand Muhigirwe. And he works with the Jesuit Social Action Institute there. And they are working on what the Catholic Church is working on very hard around the world on transparency politics and publish what you pay initiatives. They are trying to track the money trail. Track the money trail of who is profiting from this violence, so that if you can track and trace the money trail, if you can shine a light on it, you can shut it down. You can shut down the illicit profits that are gaining the warlords and are funding and fueling and facilitating the violence. Again, very dangerous work. There are a lot of people who don't want that information to come out. And so all of these folks deal with death threats, deal with threats of physical violence every day, yet they keep up the work. This is Justine Masika Bihamba. She was nominated as the Pax Christi International Peace Laureate for her work in the Congo with rape victims, with victims of violence. She worked very hard with civil society and religious groups in partnership and coalition to have rape made illegal in the Congo. Until 2006, it wasn't on the laws to actually even be illegal. Since 2006, they've been effective in having the law change, but now it's trying to get the law enforced. Very difficult when the government of Congo doesn't have much capacity. So they're working on training, on enforcement, on legal aid, on human rights. They're working directly with victims. And again, at great personal cost. Justine herself was the victim of violence. Her own children were held hostage at gunpoint by the combatants who wanted to stop her from doing her work. What would you do if your children or your family members were held hostage at gunpoint and their lives were threatened for the work that you were doing? Would you continue after that crisis was over to continue with the work? Justine did. And those like her are doing that courageous work of the church around the world every day. So not only are they working within the Congo to try to restore these victims of violence and create greater conditions of peace and justice within the Congo, but they are working across borders internationally. And we've had them here at Catholic University to speak to my students. We brought them into the halls of Congress to give their witness of what their experiences of these conflicts have been. We've brought them to the United Nations to tell their stories, to witness and testify of what it's like at the front lines of violence, to try to shut down this money trail that's facilitating and fueling the violence. Now, in this slide, there's a young, smiling gentleman in the upper corner, and that is Peter Quaranto. And he was a graduate of Notre Dame University, and during his time in his Catholic education, he had the opportunity to do what many of us offer in our own educational institutions, to do a service, a learning, study abroad, international immersion program. And he went and studied in Central Africa and the Great Lakes region and came back very animated about how pressing these issues of peace and justice were, and how we needed to be doing more in the United States to end this suffering and these ongoing wars. So he came back, he graduated with other of his compatriots, of his colleagues from Notre Dame. He started his own NGO here in Washington to try to bring to an end these conflicts in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And then he also went to work at the U.S. Senate. And in his time working as an aide in the Senate, he had the opportunity to write legislation. Now, I know many of you will be shocked that the senator he was working for himself wasn't writing the legislation, and that often lawmakers have their staffs write the legislation. But that is how it works. And because of that, even though he was not an elected official himself, he had the opportunity to help write legislation that was passed as the Conflict Minerals Transparency Act, part of the Wall Street reform, Dodd-Frank reform legislation that was passed in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Now, this new law, which Justine and Catholic Relief Services and these other groups were lobbying and advocating for, and then which Peter and others in coalition and Congress helped write and pass and change, the new law says that any company that trades in the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States must simply declare where it gets its mineral resources, its conflict minerals from. So it's not a sanction law, it's not a prohibition law, there's no penalties. It is a simple transparency law. If you're using this set of minerals that are known to come from areas of conflict, you have to simply state on your website and in a statement to the SEC where you get your minerals from. And it is hoped that by this simple act of transparency, that this will be transformative, that companies that spend billions of dollars in advertising and in creatively asking them, telling them they have to tell us where their minerals came from, that simple act of transparency will change the incentive structure, will make them want to clean up their supply chains, have a financial incentive to clean up their supply chains. Catholic Relief Services, Justine, Bishop Maroy, none of them are advocating that we should embargo the Congolese minerals or that we should not trade in them. What they would like to see happen would be a legal mineral trade, where the people of Congo would be able to get legal jobs and be able to benefit from the extraction of mineral resources in their country, and not that to have these minerals stolen by combatant groups and fueling the conflict that they are suffering from. So how to transform that from blood minerals to a legal trade that could benefit the Congolese people? And they felt that this transparency initiative would be very helpful to them, and it's been successful. So how can you contribute to that? How can you interact with those stories that I've been discussing in your own educational institutions? Well, Catholic Relief Services has a wonderful program, many of you are probably already participating in, called Catholic Relief Services Campus Ambassador Programs. And in that campus ambassador programs, you would designate some of your students who would be interested in participating. They would have an opportunity to go to Catholic Relief Services headquarters in Baltimore to get training in what it is to work in an NGO, how this process works, get training in some of these different international issues, and they come back then to the campuses very animated, excited, and they promise in return for the training they've been given to do an activity at your campus or your university. They may do an educational event, some awareness. They may do a variety of different things. But those kind of Catholic Relief Services educational outreach and campus ambassador programs are ways that our students can put their faith into action. They can also look at the Catholic Relief Services or the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops Confront Global Poverty campaign for greater resources on how you can mobilize and engage in some of these issues at your own campuses. Whoops, that wasn't the right one to push. I don't know if you can help me, Tony. I think I've... Okay, let's see. The other that they can do, and this is one thing my students have been doing on this issue with the Congo, is they can, now that we have the law has been passed and shortly the enabling regulations will be issued, is that many universities are voting to make their campuses conflict minerals free. So now that once we have this information about which cell phone companies, which laptop companies are using conflict minerals and which ones are not, you can vote with the power of your consumer purchases. So my students at Catholic University have taken this issue to the campus government, to the student government. They passed an initiative to make Catholic University conflict minerals free. Many other universities have done that. And that's another way to take these issues forward and put our faith into action. Sister Pauline Akayo of Uganda is another one of these heroic folks. The war in Uganda, neighboring to the Congo, it's been ongoing for quite some time. You've probably heard of the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony and the use of child soldiers in that conflict. Sister Pauline herself, as a child, was walking down the road to visit her grandmother with her brother when Idi Amin's troops came rumbling through and shooting up the place. She and her brother dove for their lives in the tall grasses of the African savanna, dove into the tall grasses and hid. And the troops shot, and they were trembling there in the tall grass. And eventually the soldiers said, well, we may as well go on already. We've probably killed them by now. Sister Pauline's response to that was a tremendous understanding and empathy for children caught in the crosshairs of war. And she describes it as, that was God's protection for me. God had a plan for me. He had a project for me. And she used that experience to dedicate her life to God. She became a consecrated sister. But also she is the head of Catholic Relief Services in Uganda, working on programs similar to what I've been talking about with Sister Marie Bernard in the Congo, working with programs to try to reintegrate child soldiers. Again, children are abducted, kidnapped as part of the conflict. They're forced into doing atrocious acts. And after the conflict is over, they are thrown away, seen as shunned by society as throwaway children. She said, we need to do better than that. These children are more than the child soldiers that they were forced to become. They are more than victims of this violence. They are still children of God. And we have a moral obligation to educate them and to try to give them opportunities to make something else of their lives in the whole period of time they have remaining on this planet. So she's done amazing work with reintegration of child soldiers and education and training and helping them become advocates and operatives for building peace in Uganda. Uganda has made some progress in peace in that country. They were able to bring their stories again to Capitol Hill to try to focus the U.S. foreign policy process on issues of peace in Uganda. In Sudan, many of you know, the newest country in the world, South Sudan voted to separate from the north of Sudan. The government of the north in Sudan has been indicted for crimes against humanity, war crimes by the International Criminal Tribunal, International Criminal Court. And the church in Sudan has been very heroic in standing up for peace and walking with the victims of violence and trying to help shepherd and serve as a working institution in that society while they are becoming an independent country and setting up a new government from scratch. So again, ministry to the people in Sudan, coalition with other groups in that country, coalition across the borders, and also telling their stories to the political operatives in Washington and the United Nations of what help they need and what types of policy actions would be helpful to people on the front lines. So when I'm talking about resurrection politics, this is what I'm talking about. It's not some pie-in-the-sky idea of how we might, in the future, bring about a world of greater peace and justice. I'm talking about a track record that we already have today of experiences of success stories in building greater peace and justice in some of the hardest cases and the most difficult cases of human suffering around the world. So how to take issues that were thought previously dead on arrival, that these were non-starters in Washington. So whether you're talking about the Jubilee Debt Relief Campaign, whether you're talking about human trafficking campaign that so many Catholic organizations, schools, churches, religious orders have been very, very active in combating human trafficking, modern-day slavery, or whether you're talking about these issues of war and peace that I've been telling you about, to take those issues previously thought dead on arrival and to transform them, to reframe them with values and positive images, to put the human face on the issue, to tell the stories of those at the front lines of suffering, and to change the political space by drawing on the language and the symbols of faith, to say these are not just technical issues for the international affairs, foreign policy bureaucrats to sort out. These are issues of our faith. They affect us all, and we all have an interest in seeing progress made on these issues. To use the possibilities made present for us today by transparency politics to shame and name international processes. Many of these issues that I've been discussing with you, I call it Dracula politics because Dracula could only do his dirty deeds at night. And once you shone a light on him, he disappeared. Many of these issues are so pernicious, they are so wrong, that merely shining a light on the issue, shaming people and naming the issue, and drawing a light, showing information of what is actually happening, that can go a long way to ending the problem or transforming the political space around that problem. So, for example, in human trafficking, it is nowhere legal. You know, thank God to the work of previous generations of abolitionists, slavery is nowhere legal around the world today. However, we still have lots of human trafficking and modern-day slaves in the world today, and so it's a problem of enforcement. So simply shining a light on those issues can get you a lot of action, a lot of traction on those issues to move them forward. Now, there are some challenges. I've been talking to you about the opportunities, the way this is working in practices, but there are some challenges in practicing this kind of resurrection politics. We'll talk in a minute about some of the political challenges, but I'd like to start first with some of the challenges to our faith. In practicing this type of faith in action, of resurrection politics, it really requires a more radical belief of us. For myself, it is easier for me to believe in the resurrection as a historical fact. I can believe that. I can believe that 2,000 years ago, Jesus rose from the dead. He was God. Of course he could do that. He could do all sorts of miracles. That is not so hard for me personally to believe. What's harder for me to believe is that my faith is calling me today, me, you know, all 5'3" of me, to have something to contribute, to be called to participate in resurrection in our world today. That resurrection is not just a historical fact, something that happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago in Palestine, but that resurrection is something that we are called to do in our world today. So what does it mean to be an Easter people? What does it mean to be a people who believe in the resurrection? Do we really believe this? Do we really believe we are called to participate in the incarnation of our God here on earth today? That's part of your job list today, along with doing the laundry, making the breakfast for the kids, and grading your papers and exams. Is that on your to-do list? You know, do you believe that's something we're called to do? That is more challenging for me, to believe that we can participate in resurrection today. And not just in remote areas, in areas of helplessness and hopelessness around the world, but in all those dead zones of our lives, in our personal lives, in our family lives, in our own communities and churches and educational institutions. Where are the dead zones? Where are the areas of perceived helplessness and hopelessness? That our God, this generous, creative, resurrection God, is calling us to bring life, to breathe life into all of those dead zones of our lives. That's a real challenge. That these are not just the words of the scriptures long ago, I have set before you death and life, choose life. That this is what God is calling us to do in our own lives today. So I'm actually very optimistic about this politically, for a number of reasons that have to do with global changes in the world today. I think that we actually have some historic opportunities as religious and faith-based actors to participate in transformative politics around the world today. And this is what I talk with my colleagues at the State Department, the ambassadors, as we're making our recommendations to the Secretary of State of how the U.S. government can better engage with religious actors and religious factors abroad in a more positive way. These are some of the reasons I'm optimistic about those opportunities. Because in an information age, which we all live in an information age, ideas matter. And who has ideas? We do. As faith-based organizations, we have some tremendous transformative ideas about how we can make a more peace, a more just, a more community-oriented world. And as educational institutions, we have lots of ideas as well. So we are empowered with the very currency that's very much in vogue right now. Ideas matter, and we have them. The increased availability and the decreased cost of information technologies make it easier now than ever before to transmit ideas and information across borders instantly and cheaply. So that makes it possible to organize and to advocate and to witness across borders and across great distances than ever before. So certainly our church has always been engaged in activities abroad of faith and justice, of ministering to the poor in the world. But now we have tools, we have a set of tools that makes it much easier for all of us to participate in those types of activities of our church. That we don't have to sign up to become a missionary and leave our communities for years at a time to be able to participate in this work. We can actively participate from our vocations as educators here in the United States. In this 24/7 information environment, the little guys, you and I, can be transformed and empowered. We have some amazing resources that we bring to the task. We have both extensive global institutions and rich networks. So all of us have these global networks. Our own universities have networks and relationships with universities abroad. Our alumni networks, as our students graduate and go on to hold different positions of power in various sectors of the world. We have these rich global networks as church, as universities, and as persons, as people. We have the ability to be both local and universal church in a way that's much more concrete today. And we operate in many different functional areas, from education, healthcare, diplomacy, development, so we're active in a very different and diverse variety of functions. We have not just the brick and mortar, our churches and our universities and our hospitals, but we have this deep ethical capacity, these ideas of an alternative vision of what the world could look like. An alternative vision of the world, not just as a place of profits to be made, not just as a problem for governance, but an alternative vision of the world as a community, as all members of the body of Christ. That's a very transformative and a very different idea of the world than many other ideas of the world that are in circulation today. And we have this common language of our faith, our values, our rituals that we bring to this. And we're not new to this. As Catholics, we have 2,000 years' experience of operating as a global institution. So this is not something that we're just deciding to get involved with in issues across our borders. So how then, if we have all these resources and these possibilities and these ways of engaging and putting our faith into action, what are some of the challenges we face? And I think one of the challenges I mentioned was the religious idea. Do we believe the resurrection is something we're called to participate in today? But I also think one of the biggest obstacles is this myth of our own impotence. The myth that we cannot do anything to change these problems, that these problems are bigger, broader, more powerful than we are. And the very false ideology that's in so much in currency in the world today, that the status quo is inevitable, that war, injustice will always be with you, and you are powerless to do anything about it. That is a myth. It is empirically incorrect. As a professor, I can tell you, I can give you dozens more examples than I've given you already. Empirically, it is incorrect. And I think more, in a more disparaging way, what we see is a politics of despair and of cynicism that is deeply at odds with our Christian faith, parading as realism, parading as something that really cannot be overcome. And that's a very powerful thing that we need to overcome, this sense of our own impotence. Can I ask for a show of hands of everyone in the room who has or has access to a cell phone? Okay. My own hand included. I was one of the last, dragged kicking and screaming to it, but I do, in fact, have one as well. Can I ask for a show of hands of everyone in the room who has a high school or greater level of education? Okay, not surprising in a room full of educators. You all have more power at your hands than most people around the world. Most women and girls in Africa are lucky to get 5 years of poor quality education. That's all she wrote. That's all they get. That's all my grandmother had, okay? All of us have more power now from that education that we have and that we participate in and that we extend to others than most of the people on the planet today. We all have cell phones. We are globally connected through that, through our information technologies. We have the ability to access information through our computers, through our networks, to integrate information, and to disperse, to send information globally. It used to be only the very rich and powerful had the ability to do that. Now you and I have the ability to do that daily. We are extremely powerful, but we have to overcome this myth of our own impotence. We also have to expand our moral imaginations, our ideas about who we are connected to in the world today. Now, this is a picture of my children again, and I understand that when there are problems of peace and injustice, problems of conflict and injustice in the home, when the children are fighting over the same toy, I know that it's my job to restore peace and justice in the home, to deal with that problem. I've got no sense of illusion that that's my job, to try to help bring peace and harmony in the home. But somehow we think that in these issues of conflict around the world, that that's not our job, that that is the president's job in foreign policy, that's the job of Congress, that's the job of the United Nations. These issues of peace and justice around the world are somehow not our job, not our responsibility. And I challenge us to think about our global connections that all of us have as educators and as Catholics, our connections to the church around the world, to realize this is our family. And as family members, we have family responsibilities to try to do our part on these issues, even as educators here in the United States. Now, I know Matthew gave you a wonderful description of my bio that's in the program, but the one thing you probably need to know about me more than anything is that my uncle, who's shown in the picture there, well, that my parents were both Catholic educators, but that my uncle was a Jesuit missionary working in Nigeria. So I grew up hearing these stories of peace and justice around the world. I grew up with the idea, the expansive imagination, that we are all part of one human family, and that, you know, one person coming from Western New York can go to Africa and make a difference. And those are the ideas that I would challenge us all to bring into our classrooms and our communities, to expand the moral imagination of our students and ourselves, to understand our connections to the wider world, not just in terms of information conveyed about these wider issues, but to offer our students the possibility to participate, to engage in relationships with people around the world. Now, as educators, we all know that experiential education works, right? We know that the more you can engage your students on several sensory dimensions, whether it's the eye, the ear, touch, taste, whether it's getting them moving in the classroom, whether it's doing service learning, immersion learning, offering them interactive opportunities in our classroom or in our communities. We know that this works. It allows the students to integrate the information, to take it on board, to remember it longer, to recover it better and faster. And we also know when we survey our alumni, what are the most meaningful experiences they have in our institutions? It's often in those experiential education programs. It's in Habitat for Humanity, or the spring break service trips, or the community service trips within our own areas. Those are the things they remember. Those are the things that transform them. So I'm asking you to think about ways in which we can provide our students with those opportunities to put their faith into action, that it's not enough to give them the walking list of content information, but to give them the opportunities to engage in relationships with people around the world, and in that way to really do faith formation in a much more meaningful, interactive way. We have to overcome this idea that as individuals, as institutions, we have no power, because at this time we're very empowered by our new technologies. But we also have to overcome this idea that's persistent in the political sphere, and this is what a lot of my work with the State Department and the government is on, that religion has no place in the public sphere. There's a couple of ways in which that myth gets propagated. One is this view that religion is not important. Okay, that religious motivations, religious actors, religious factors are unimportant in international politics. This is Paul Wolfowitz, who was the dean of my graduate school at Johns Hopkins University, who was also one of the architects of the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq. And he said, it's hard to conceive that it would take more forces to provide stability in Iraq than it would to change the regime, to bring the fall of Saddam Hussein. And he said, Iraq will become a place of tolerance and freedom in the Muslim world. Now, of course, that didn't happen. And we know that Iraq is now on the list of worst abusers of religious freedom, worst intolerance in the world today, among those lists put out by the State Department, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. How could such a smart guy, as my former dean, get that so wrong? One of the ways he got that so wrong is this idea that religion is not important, the old idea that only governments of states are important, how many divisions does the Pope have? Religious groups don't have guns or much money, so in international politics, they're not very important. Well, guess what? True. Religious groups are very important in the positive sense, as we've been discussing, and also sometimes in the negative sense. So the one view, the myth, is that religion is unimportant. The other myth is that religion can only be a source of division and conflict, as we saw on September 11th. So if religion is important at all, it's only a source of violence, not a potential source of peace and justice. So therefore, you ought to keep religion out of the public sphere because religion is trouble. And religion is just going to bring you sectarian violence and war. Both of those views are empirically incorrect. They really fail to understand the great possibilities that faith-based actors bring to the table in international politics for being able to bring transformation capabilities to a variety of peace and justice issues around the world. So that's what I've been challenging my cohorts in the government, to think about religion more than just a problem, more than just perhaps unimportant because they don't have guns or they're not the government, and think about the ways in which we bring tremendous resources to international politics. Throughout history, we know that Catholics have brought our ideas to the public sphere, and those ideas have been transformative. I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, the International Military Codes of Justice, these things didn't drop down from space. These ideas came from our moral ideas that often came from our religious traditions. So we know that from the abolition movements centuries ago to these various social movements that I've been talking about today, we have a track record, and we know that religious ideas and religious actors and religious coalitions can bring very tremendous and transformative things to the political environment. There's lots of opportunities, as I've mentioned before, not just in areas of peace and justice, but environmental issues, human trafficking issues. There are a whole variety of issues on which you can get your students engaged in. But the reason I think this is important now is because religion is resurgent around the world at precisely the time that our governments are challenged. So religion is not going to go away. And we have to figure out a way for our governments of states to engage with religious actors and factors in a much more constructive way. So I think I'm going to end it there and just go forward. I think we've already talked about the ways in which we can bring information to bear on these issues, the ways in which we can transform the space through our symbols, the ways in which we can be the voice of the voiceless around the world, in which we can carry their witness forward in the political arena, call for greater accountability, and bring a new opportunity for politics in a different forum when sometimes politics is stopped or blocked at the local level. So if they can't get a solution in Congo, how can we try to get more aid to them internationally if their politics is blocked at the local level? So I think what we have is needed in the world now more than ever. And because we have all of these great resources, it very much is the parable of the talents. To those to whom much is given, much is expected. So what are we going to do with this huge cornucopia of resources that we have at our fingertips every day? The enthusiasm of our students, the power of our social networks, the power of our networks as international and local church, the power of our ideas. What are we going to do with those to participate in the resurrection in our communities and around the world? One of my favorite quotes from Alice in Wonderland, the book, not the movie, is when the White Queen says to Alice, she's chastising Alice for having insufficient imagination, for not exercising her imagination enough. That imagination requires exercise to be able to get good at it. And she says, well, my dear, sometimes I think 6 impossible thoughts before breakfast. So we've all had our breakfast. Are we thinking 6 impossible thoughts today? What are those impossible thoughts? You know, peace in the Congo, peace in Sudan, an end to human trafficking, a more green and vibrant world. What are the impossible thoughts that animate and inspire you and your students? Think those 6 impossible thoughts before breakfast. But after breakfast, we have to do them, knowing, empowered by our faith in a creative and generous God, that nothing is impossible with God. Thank you very much for your time and attention this morning, and we'll leave time for questions.